I'd like to welcome you today to the study that we're going to be going through. I want to kind of just look at the story of Joseph, who was sold by his brothers into Egypt, and see what pieces of information we might be able to get out of this story. We're going to be running through it kind of slowly, taking it piece by piece and trying to decode it or decipher what might be in it of importance. And so don't get excited. We're not going to read the whole story in this one setting. This is going to be split up into small studies, and we're just going to look at the individual pieces one by one if we can. And so, beginning, as we study much of the scriptures, we find many stories of times gone by. We also find many prophecies, but there are also many stories that are prophecies. These are called types. What is a scriptural type? A type is a person or thing, typically in the Old Testament period, that is believed to have foreshadowed of another person or thing, typically in the New Testament or in time period. A good example is the word Messiah. There are actually several Messiah types in the Old Testament. They were people whose lives in some way typified the one true Messiah, Jesus Christ. An interesting type in the Old Testament is King Cyrus, who was king of the Medes and Persians. He was called in the Bible a Messiah. Isaiah 45:1. It says, "Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus." The word anointed here actually translates to Messiah in Hebrew, and that's interesting. And so what you have here in Cyrus is this Messiah that is not even a believer as far as we know. But he is someone important to the saving of God's people. And that's important in this story because as we get into the story of Joseph, we see Joseph as a savior type person for his people. And I think that'll come into play in these end times as we get into this prophecy. So the story we want to look at is the story of Joseph, who was sold by his brothers to Egypt. The story is very possible a type of the end days. We were given this prophetic word out of the book of Ether, out of the book of Mormon, Ether 6:6, and that a new Jerusalem should be built up upon this land, the Americas, unto the remnant of the seed of Joseph, for the which thing there has been a type. And so it tells us right there what's happening here. It's already happened. There was already an example of it. The first part of this type, of course, is when God saves Lehi and his family and brings them to the New World. Again, God being the type of Joseph here. And in these end days, because of course this was specific passage in Ether 6 is referring to the latter days, it gives us the understanding that it will come to play again. That whole story of Joseph going into Egypt and what happened in some way is going to relate to what's going to be happening in these last days. Therefore, it behooves us to get into the story and understand it better. And so that's what we're going to do. So let's have a look at the story of Joseph and see what treasures, if any, we may find. We're going to be reading predominantly in the book of Genesis 37 through this we're going to be starting in Genesis 37 and reading it in very small parts. I don't know that I'll cover the whole story. I'm going to be covering the parts that I think are applicable to us today as I see them. And I'm likely to miss some pieces here, but I'm just going to try to give you some of the small pieces that I'm maybe seeing in this story. So, without further ado, let's begin. Genesis 37, verse 1. And Jacob dwelt in the land wherein his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding his flock with his brethren. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah, and with the sons of Silpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all of his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all of his brethren, they hated him, and could not speak peaceably unto him. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told his brethren, and they hated him yet more. And so we have the beginning of our story here. We can see Joseph's pretty young at this point. He's still only 17 years old. We can see that he has a little bit of a good idea about what's right and wrong. He's bringing his father reports about the evil that his brother's doing. And we can see that there's a great a love that Israel has for Joseph. And we'll probably touch on some more of these parts later on in our study at some point, maybe not in this particular part 1, but in future studies in regards to the coat of many colors and whatnot. But we can see that there is already some distinguishing here between Joseph and his brethren. And it says in verse 5, "And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brethren, and they hated him yet more." And so we can see that Joseph's got a sense of spirituality to him, and his brothers do not like it. It says, "And he said unto them, Hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we are binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright. And behold, your sheaves stood round about, and made obeisance to my sheaf. And his brethren said to him, Shalt thou indeed reign over us? Or shalt thou indeed have dominance over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. And he dreamed yet another dream, and told it to his brethren. And he said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. And he told it to his father and to his brethren, and his father rebuked him. And he said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee, to the earth? And his brethren envied him, but his father observed the saying." And so here we have the very first piece of this study, and we're just kind of focus on this for the moment. And we're going to break it down. So let's look at this first dream first. Now, in order to understand what this dream is trying to say, we have to break it down into the important parts and then find some scriptures that can give us fuller meaning of those important parts. So this is the actual dream, the first one. He said, we, and I have underlined here the words that I'm going to try to focus on. Not saying that anything else isn't important. I'm just trying to focus on these to give us some more understanding. And so it says, we were binding sheaves. So there's a distinguishing there between the we and the sheaves. In the field, and lo, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright. And behold, your sheaf stood round about, and made obeisance to my sheaf. And so right away in this dream, we can see that there's reason for his brothers to hate him and envy him. Just reading it at face value, he seems to be saying that whatever he was doing has some greater importance or value than what his brothers are doing. And that's just what it seems like at face value. And if you're only going to take it as face value, you might get that. But you know, as we're looking here, I think that there's some finer points that we need to bring out. And there's another story, another prophecy that I think can give us some information as to some of the words in this dream. And so let's have a look at Matthew chapter 13, verses 37 through 43. And this is a different prophecy. It's a prophecy that Jesus himself gave. And the important part of it is Jesus himself gave some definitions to some of the words that we see in this dream of Joseph's. So let's read this. Matthew 13, 37 through 43. And he answered and said unto them, He that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world. The reapers are the angels. As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of the world. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend them which do and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire, and there shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who hath ears, let him hear. And so here we have some similar terminology that I think we can bring out here. So the master of the field is Christ. That's vitally important because the dream that Joseph had is likely not so much talking about himself, even though his brothers automatically latch on to the idea that this has something to do with Joseph personally and them personally. Likely it probably doesn't have much to do with that. The field, it said, is symbolic of the world, and the seeds, which it talks about in the parable in Matthew, it focuses on the seeds here, where in Joseph's dream we're talking about sheaves. And so we have a progression here in size, I believe, more than anything. So the seeds were symbolic of individuals, which would probably mean that each stalk of wheat or tare is a small group unit or identity, whereas the bundles or sheaves would be larger group units or identities. And I think that's important in the story and in the understanding of the story. So when we take a second look at Joseph's dream, adding in what we have learned from Matthew 13, the field being the world, the sheaves, likely large groups, stood upright. And of course, if we look at that in the Strong's Hebrew, word 5324, it means to establish or be established, which I think is important. And of course, the word obeisance, more than just a worship. When I look it up in the dictionary, it gives me this interpretation: a movement of the body, which is what it said. It says the sheaves bowed, in a sense, or made obeisance, in token of respect or submission, acknowledgement of another's superiority or importance. And so I think that's important. Their bowing doesn't necessarily mean they're worshiping, but rather they could be acknowledging the importance of this other one. And so when we go back to the actual dream and add some of this in, we can see we could be the patriarchs. It could be the disciples of Jesus Christ. It could be leadership, all of which are being led by Jesus himself. They were binding sheaves, and of course the sheaves would be large groups of people. We're talking about maybe congregations in the field or out in the world, and lo, my sheaf, his end work, whatever he accomplished, arose and was restored, because the word arose there means to be restored, and also stood upright. So you have two things happening here. It's being restored, it's being brought back, and then it's being established. And I think those are important to separate in our thought pattern. And behold, your sheaves, the end work of the others, stood round about and made obeisance, or showed respect or acknowledgement to my sheaf. And so I think there's more in this story than maybe what his brothers were looking at face value. They were looking at, the distinction because of jealousy between Joseph and him having dreams and sounding like he was trying to lift himself up and having dreams. But the reality is, if Joseph was a very spiritual person, he's not going to want to lift himself up. And so I think they were probably misinterpreting some things from the very get-go here. So let's continue into this. So thinking about the we, there is a parable in the Book of Mormon that comes to mind, and we don't need to read all of it at this time, but I just want to look at a couple verses, and that parable is in Jacob chapter 3. It's the parable of the olive tree, and we're just going to look at verses 45 through 47, then jump to 68, and then jump to 125 to 127. It's good if you have time to go ahead and read all of it, because I think it comes together with this dream that Joseph himself is having. I think there's some parallels in here that are very important. But I just want to touch on some pieces of it when we're looking at the we itself. And so verses 45 through 47 say, "Wherefore go thy way, watch the tree, and nourish it according to my words. And these will I place in the nethermost parts of my vineyard, whithersoever I will. It mattereth not to thee. And I do it that I may preserve unto myself the natural branches of the tree, and also that I may lay up fruit thereof against the season unto myself. For it grieveth me that I should lose this tree and the fruit thereof." And so as we're thinking about this, in this particular parable, in this part is speaking of Lehi and his family as they were moved over to the promised land. And he talks about here that they're in the nethermost part of his vineyard. They're basically protected and shielded from the rest of the world. And he says, I do it. And so when you think about the we in Joseph's dream, he as a separate entity is looking at what these sheaves, which are 12 sheaves, he's looking at 11 sheaves doing obeisance or bowing to one. So there's actually 12 sheaves out there. He's looking on from an outside perspective. And so this very well may be Jesus Christ, in a sense, in Joseph's dream, looking at the work that the patriarchs, the disciples, and other leadership are doing in the work. But he says, I do this. And so he's the one that's directing all of this work. Now let's jump to verse 68. And he says unto his servant, Look hither, and behold the last. Behold, this I have planted in a good spot of ground, and I have nourished it this long time. And only a part of the tree hath brought forth tame fruit, and the other part of the tree hath brought forth wild fruit. Behold, I have nourished this tree like unto the others. And so we have this continuation of this story. He comes to this last tree again, and he sees this tree is split. Doesn't necessarily mean 50-50, but it says half and half roughly. One half of it is tame, good fruit, good to eat. The other half, not so much so. And so he's looking at this and he's saying, I've nourished this. I did this work, and yet half of the tree isn't doing so well. But others are looking on. And this is interesting in the story. Now let's continue to 125 to 127. Wherefore, go to and call servants, that we may labor diligently with our mites in the vineyard, that we may prepare the way, that I may bring forth again the natural fruit, which natural fruit is good, and the most precious above all other fruits. Wherefore, let us go to and labor with all our mights at this last time. For behold, the end draweth nigh. And this is for the last time that I shall prune my vineyard. Graft in the branches, beginning at the last, that they may be first, and that the first may be last. Dig about the trees, both old and young, the first and the last, and the last and the first, that all may be nourished once again for this last time. And so you have this last piece of effort that Christ is doing, that God is doing on his vineyard. He's starting with the last, which if you read through this whole parable, Lehi and his family group that is here were the last piece to that. And so you're seeing the beginning of this last work, starting with Lehi's family unit here in the Americas, his descendants many years later. And the call here is go and call other servants. And in a sense, that's kind of what Joseph's seeing in his dream. He's seeing him and his brothers as servants gathering sheaves. And so the first tree here begins to produce fruit. Let's go to and labor with all of our mights for this last time. And we're going to read a couple other verses here that talk about more the standing up erect. So thinking about the need to stand erect or upright brings us to two other prophecies that tie in nicely to this dream from Joseph. And so you can see this effort that's happening with the leadership to gather in these sheaves, and in particular focusing on this branch of Joseph, but focusing also on this latter work, which starts with the Americas and the descendants of Lehi. Let's go to 2 Nephi chapter 7, verses 1 through 4. And it says, And now I, Jacob, speak unto you again, my beloved brethren, concerning this righteous branch of which I have spoken. For behold, the promise which we have obtained are promises unto us, according to the flesh. Wherefore, as it hath been shown unto me, that many of our children shall perish in the flesh because of unbelief, nevertheless, God will be merciful unto many, and our children shall be restored, that they may come to that which will give them the true knowledge of their Redeemer. And so when we recall the dream that Joseph had, he sees his sheaf first arising, being restored, at which time they're coming to the knowledge of their true Redeemer, which then brings us to the next piece. 3 Nephi chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. But if they will repent and hearken unto my words, and harden not their hearts, I will establish my church among them, and they shall come in unto the covenant, and be numbered among this the remnant of Jacob, unto whom I have given this land for their inheritance. And they shall assist my people, the remnant of Jacob, and also as many of the house of Israel as shall come, that they may build a city which shall be called the New Jerusalem. And then they shall assist my people, that they may be gathered in, which are scattered upon all the face of the land, in unto the New Jerusalem. And then shall the power of heaven come down among them, and I will be in the midst, and then shall the work of the Father commence at that day, even when this gospel shall be preached among the remnant of this people. And I think this is pretty important. The words that are here, we have that arising, now we have this establishment. And this establishment here combines people from different backgrounds. You have Gentiles coming in, you have the house of Judah coming in, you have the house of Lehi, and they're working together to establish what is being called here the New Jerusalem, or a city. And we really can't get into that topic in this study. That's going to take a study all on its own. But I suspect this is less of a physical city and a physical New Jerusalem as it is more spiritual. But I may be wrong in that. But important, in verse 3 it says, and then shall they assist my people, that they shall be gathered in. And so you have this work being done starting from that one sheave that stood erect. So this first dream brings us to a possible understanding that one day a branch of the house of Joseph will be restored and rise up because of the work of the servant, or Messiah, ben Joseph, as it were, and be recognized for its righteousness, and that it might be the tool or the way in which God will bring the rest of Israel to the knowledge of the truth of the gospel. And this is interesting, as I talked about types in the beginning, and we talked about Cyrus. In some of the older writings of different Jewish rabbis, they always talked about really two very prominent messiahs that were important to them, one being called Messiah ben David, which would be the Messiah that comes back in the essence of David as a king. And then the other would be this Messiah ben Joseph, which comes back basically emanating or living again the life of Joseph of Egypt, in the sense that he's going to save his family from some terrible event. And so as we're looking at this story, it's possible that this first dream is speaking towards this Messiah ben Joseph effort of saving the family. And when it talks about the other sheaves doing obeisance, it may be just simply a recognition for the effort that's being done, rather than in any kind of an adoration or something like that. Last verse I want to read, 3 Nephi chapter 10, verse 7. Yea, and then shall the work commence with the Father among all nations, in preparing the way whereby his people may be gathered home to the land of their inheritance. And so you see this beginning work, which then feeds into a larger work of bringing all God's people in unto him. And as it said in one of the previous verses we read, I do think that there's a physical aspect to this. I do think that, of course, in Revelations, it talks about the 144,000, which I think is an important passage, and it talks about pieces of 11 different tribes that will be brought in. And of course it speaks of 12 different tribes there, but we know the difference between the passage in Revelations and the passage in the Old Testament is that one of the Old Testament tribes, I believe it's Dan, is excluded in Revelations. And on the other hand, in Revelations, what you have is two tribes from Joseph being mentioned. You have the tribe of Joseph as one, and the tribe of Manasseh, which happens to be the tribe that Lehi fell into, his descendants, who came here to the Americas. And so I think these all start to come together and play together in this dream that Joseph's seeing of the sheaves. I know typically when we read the story of the sheaves and the dream that Joseph had, we think about the fulfillment in the fact that his brothers went over to Egypt and bowed before him, etc. But it's really unlikely that is the real understanding. While that was a very simple fulfillment of it, I'm not sure that was the real understanding of this dream or the real purpose of this dream to Joseph. As we read in the Book of Mormon itself, it talks about Joseph having seen this people in the Americas. And I think that's important because I think in Joseph's writings himself, he may have seen his descendants on this land. And so more likely these dreams have to do with that. And so this is the end of the first part of the study. I know it's kind of short, but I suspect that each one of these pieces, it's better to break them down in smaller bite-sized pieces so we can think about them. If you have any comments or thoughts on this, feel free to send me a message on Messenger or on WhatsApp, as whatever you prefer to use, and give me your thoughts on it. Thanks, and I hope that you have a blessed day.